Well, hello there, all you beautiful people, and thank you for joining me again for another tech question video. In this video, I'm going to answer a tech question, and if you have a tech question you like to have answered, make sure you just leave a comment below with your question and I may get to it. You don't have to subscribe, you don't have to like anything, you don't have to click anything, just ask your question below, and if I know the answer and have time, I'll get to it. Today's question actually doesn't come from a comment on a YouTube video or anything like that. It actually came from a conversation I was having with a customer. Now, this customer is really struggling with working with dynamic properties. What I mean by that is they were dealing with a lot of dynamic data, and they had areas of their application that were pretty dynamic, which means that they don't know what these property names or values will be until runtime. And so, you know, they were kind of coming from the JavaScript world where it's very easy to create dynamic objects with dynamic properties and all this great stuff. It's very flexible and dynamic in JavaScript. But what about C#? You know, in this application, they have a requirement where they have like dynamic areas of their app. So they don't know property names, they don't know their values, but they need to build up these UI elements based on these properties and their values. And so they were really struggling with how to do this in C#. How do I build dynamic objects and add properties to these objects dynamically at runtime when you have no idea what these values and property names are going to be? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how to use both the ExpandoObject and a dynamic object. And just to kind of drive home the concept, we're actually going to be parsing a CSV file to a JSON object. Well, actually a collection of JSON objects to really demonstrate how powerful these dynamic objects can be. Let's not wait any longer. Let's go ahead and get right into the code. Now, the application we are working with today is a very simple .NET 5 console application. Now, we want to start adding properties dynamically at runtime in our application for whatever reason. Now, if you were to Google this, the most popular approach to this you're going to find is using what's called an ExpandoObject. So let's go ahead and define one of those now. We're going to use the dynamic keyword. I'm going to call this expando equals new ExpandoObject. Now, the dynamic keyword essentially says this object we're creating isn't known until runtime. Okay, we don't know what this is at all. It could be anything. In this case, we're calling it an ExpandoObject. Now, an ExpandoObject is just it's like a property bag. Okay, if we look at this definition, we can see that it implements an iCollection, a key value pair, IEnumerable, IDictionary, INotify property change. So it's essentially a property bag. It's a dictionary of properties and actions that we can add. So for example, I can say, hey, expando.FirstName equals Brian. And we can write this out. We'll say console.WriteLine expando.FirstName. Now I want to point out, because everything isn't known until runtime, you can see when I type this out, there was no IntelliSense because we don't know what this object really is. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to run this application and we can see, oh, Brian was spit out. Okay, so I was able to define a property on this ExpandoObject dynamically, right? Just define it, just add it to the object, and now I can read that object. But what happens if I try to read an object that we haven't defined yet? So let's say console.WriteLine expando.LastName. Well, we haven't defined this object yet. We're not getting any compile errors, but we're trying to read it. So if we go ahead and run this, we're going to see we have an exception. Okay, so that's kind of where you can run into some issues with using ExpandoObject, and the fact that if you try to use something that hasn't been defined, at runtime it'll crash. You won't know until runtime. I want to point out, I want to get back to this in a minute, but I also want to take this moment to point out that, you know, you can add not only properties, but you can add methods as well. So for example, I can say expando dot, I'm gonna call it, I don't know, invoke equals a new action. And this action is gonna do something like, I don't know, how about it does console.WriteLine, I did something, right? And then we can call this as a method on our object, invoke, right? So I dynamically added this method to our property at runtime. So Brian, I did something. Okay, well that's pretty cool. So now we're kind of seeing where we can start, dynamically creating objects. That's what this really is. You're dynamically creating an object. However, I don't find this particularly useful in a real world scenario. The reason being is most of the time when you're doing something dynamic, you don't know what those property names are. So you can't define them ahead of time, right? So for example, let's say I just had a string coming from somewhere. I don't know where it's coming from, but it's called property name. And in this case, it's called last name. Okay. And then we have another one coming from somewhere called property value. And it equals, not a number, Lagunas. Okay. So we have the property name and the property value coming from somewhere. We don't know where it's coming from. How do we add this to the Expando object? So for example, in JavaScript, I can do something like this. Property name equals property value. And then we can say console.writeLine expando property name. Well, I can do this in JavaScript, but what happens if we do this here? It doesn't work. We can't do it this way. It completely breaks. And this is one of my favorite features of JavaScript, actually, when dealing with a lot of dynamic data, especially dealing with files. Now, there is a way to kind of do this. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete this. We can still add properties dynamically to ExpandoObject, but we first have to cast that as an IDictionary. So I'll just call this dictionary for now, equals expando as an IDictionary of string object. Once you have that cast, now you can say, hey, dictionary, I'm going to add something to the dictionary. It's going to be the property name and then the property value. Now we can say console.writeLine and we'll say expandos.lastName. Because now this has been defined on the object, right? So let's go ahead and run the application. And as you can see, Brian, I did something Lagunas. This is the gist of creating properties dynamically in C#, creating objects dynamically. But as you can see, there's some limitations here, and I'm personally not a big fan of ExpandoObject. As I said earlier, if you Googled and did research, this is the approach people are going to tell you to use. Well, I want to show you a different approach. Okay, I'm going to comment all this out. I want to introduce you to something called a dynamic object. Now, a dynamic object is a base class that you use to derive from to create your own dynamic. So for example, I'm going to create a class here. I'm going to call it dynamic, and it's going to derive from dynamic object. Now I'll have my var, we'll call it dynamic equals new dynamic. Now, what happens if I go to add dynamic.FirstName here? And we'll say console.writeLine. We'll say dynamic.FirstName. And actually, I can't call this dynamic, I have to say dynamic. And this can get confusing, so I'm going to rename this to something like, you know what, let's rename this to DynamicObject, just to make it a little more clear what's going on here. Okay, so what we want to do first is we want to implement the same kind of behavior of ExpandoObject, but what happens when we do this? Well, we get an exception, and that's because our dynamic object here doesn't know anything about first name or getting members or anything like that. Because we're deriving from dynamic object, it's our responsibility to control the behavior of this object. So in order to get the same Expando object behavior that we have up above, now what I want to do is I'm going to modify our custom object. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm going to let's add a dictionary of string object, just like the Expando was, right? I'll just call this dictionary. Let's see, dictionary equals new dictionary of string object. Now there's two methods that I'm going to want to override here. I'm going to override a try get member and I want to override the try set member. This essentially is going to tell our dynamic object how to actually treat these members that we're creating. Okay, so in this case, I can actually return this. I'm going to say return dictionary dot try get value binder dot name, and we'll keep the rest the same. We're basically going to get this information out of our dictionary. So that also means I'm just going to return true here, that we want to store these in our dictionary. So we can say dictionary index of binder dot name equals value. Okay, so that's all I've done. I just implemented these two methods. I'm going to run it, and let's see what happens. There we go. We now had the same behavior of the ExpandoObject up here that we were playing around with. But now you're saying, well, Brian, I mean, what's the point of doing this? Why can't I? It looks like Expando's still better to use. Yeah, I mean, we're adding a little bit of code, but this provides us more flexibility of how we control the API. So for example, ExpandoObject, we have to cast to a dictionary and then call add off dictionary. What if we had a cool little method here, void, called add property, and we just passed a name and value. Whoops, forgot to add my object. Now what I can do is I can just kind of cut that out of here. I'll paste that in here, modify the code, and here we can call add property, binder.name, just doing a little refactoring here, and then value. Now I can come up here and I can say, oh, you know what? DynamicObject dot add property, last name, Lagunas. And then let's console.writeLine our DynamicObject.last name, just so we can see it. Go ahead and run this application again. And as you can see, there's Brian Lagunas. Now, what this essentially does is it allows us to add methods to kind of simplify the API a little bit. So instead of casting our ExpandoObject to a dictionary and then adding to the dictionary, we can simply just add a method to the object itself called add property and handle it that way. So this makes handling those dynamic scenarios where you don't know the property name, they're just coming from out of thin air. This makes it a lot easier to handle those and to manage that kind of code. But I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. I really like the ability to do something like this. Right? I mean, I really, really like doing that. And so something else that I would like to be able to do is write line dynamic object index of age and read that property out. Now, if we're to do this right now, obviously this is going to crash. This isn't going to work. But because we're using a custom dynamic object, guess what we can do? We can add a public object. This, we'll say string, index of string, property name. Property name. Okay. So we're going to expose this, this property, if you will. We're going to have a getter and we're going to have a setter. So if I'm going to get this, guess what I can do? Dictionary index of property name. See where I'm going with this? Oh, got to return that. And if I'm going to set it, guess what? How I'm setting it? Add property, property name, value. Right? Now, since we've added this custom code, we can now have an API that looks like this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this application. And here you go, Brian Lagunas 32. So now when you have these properties, these property names that are coming from who knows where, and you want a, an easier API to work with, this might be an option for you instead of just using ExpandoObject. Something like this is really nice to work with. And if you're JavaScript or work in JavaScript, this feels a little more natural coming from the JavaScript space. Now what I want to do is I want to show a more real-world example of when you even care about this type of dynamic behavior. Like you're going to say, Brian, when exactly would I use dynamic properties like this? Well, in a real-world scenario, you might want to parse a file. So in this case, you know what? Let's comment this out. We don't care about this. We'll keep moving on down. I have a file here called metalcount.csv. And it's just, it's a CSV file, common delimited file, showing the country and how many gold, silver, bronze medals they have and the totals of each of those for each country, okay? These are like the top 25 or something like that. So what I want to do is I want to parse this CSV file. I'm going to convert the CSV file into a JSON object. So in order to help achieve that, I'm going to use a dynamic object to parse the CSV file. Then I'm going to serialize that dynamic object out into JSON that's more usable in other places. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I'm going to create a method called parse CSV. Let's go ahead and define this. Now, the first step to parsing any type of file is we need to actually read the file in. So I'm going to say var lines equals, I think it's file. Let's add our system.io, read all lines. And then I'm going to pass in the name, which is medal-count.csv. Next is we need the properties, the names of the properties for these objects. Now, these property names are going to be coming from the first line here, which is going to be, we're going to have a property called country, a property gold, silver, bronze, total. These are our property names, so we need those. So we'll say property names equals lines, index of 0, and we want to split those on our comma, because it's a comma delimited file. Now we have these property names. What we have to do is we have to loop through all the lines in the file, and then we'll start dynamically creating these objects as we loop through each line. Okay, so we're going to say for int x equals 1 because we've already started. We've already parsed that first line. Okay, we'll say x is less than lines dot length. And then we'll increment x. So now we're going to loop through each of the lines here. Now we'll start with the current line. Current line equals lines index of x. We're going to split this on the comma as well. That's going to give us an array of all the values on that current line. And then what we have to do is we're going to have to go through these lines. And I see I have a messed up little space there. We want to loop through all these values. Okay, so first what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna come up here and we're gonna create a list of objects. I don't know what kind of objects these are, but they're objects. These are gonna be the dynamic objects. Okay, so now we have the list of dynamic objects. We're looping through each line. So now this is where we need to create our dynamic object. Now, if we look up here, let's start first. We're going to use ExpandoObject for this first one. So I'm going to create dynamic, we'll call it a data object equals new expando object as IDictionary. Actually, let's not even make that dynamic. We'll just make that IDictionary. This will make it a little easier because now we're working with a dictionary object here. Otherwise, we'd have to cast it. So I'm just kind of doing it in one go, okay? Now what we want to do is we want to say, hey, for int y equals 0, y is less than, what are we doing here? We're going to do properties, right? Less than properties, property names. Because for each object, we need to loop through the property names, dot length. And then we're going to say y plus plus. So now we're looping through each of those property lines. Now we can say, okay, we need to add these properties to this data object. Okay, so since we have the data object, we can just add it, and we'll say property names index of y, and the value is going to be the current line index of y. Right? Makes sense? And then after this happens, the final step is to add our data objects collection. We want to add our data object to our data object collection. Whew, okay, that is a mouthful, but this should give you an idea of kind of what's happening here, right? We're reading all the lines, we're getting the property names from the first line, then we're going to loop through the remaining lines. We're going to start at 1 for our little incrementer here. We're going to get the current line, We're going to split it to get an array of all of them. Now for each property name, okay, we're going to loop through that. We're going to add that property name with its associated value. Okay, so that we're kind of creating that mapping dynamically at runtime. Now, once we have all of these data objects created, this is where we can do JSON string equals called JSON serializer, I believe. What is that called? Yes, it is JSON serializer right there. JSON.text .serialize, and then we want data objects. Then we can console.writeLine our JSON string. Pretty easy, right? Okay, let's go ahead and run the application and see what happens. Well, there we go. There's all our JSON that was dynamically generated. It's kind of hard to read, so I'm going to actually fix this just a little bit. You can see we can add some JSON serializer options. So I'm going to say new JSON serializer options. Okay. And then I think there's something with indent. Yeah, right indented equals true. Perfect. So what's that do for us? Well, I'm going to run this, and now we'll see that all these objects, the JSON objects, have been written out in a nice formatted manner for us, right? We can say, oh, country, United States, 39 gold, 41 silver. You get the idea. But by using the ExpandoObject, we were able to dynamically generate all those objects coming from the CSV file. Then we can serialize those directly to JSON. Not too bad. So, you know, parsing files is an extremely useful scenario for using dynamic objects like ExpandoObject. Now, I do want to go over doing the same thing, but using our dynamic object that we've created. Okay, so in this case, let's do something a little different. We're going to say dynamic data object equals new dynamic. Whoops. Dynamic. Okay, so we're going to change it a little bit to use our object now. So we'll change that to add property because we have an add property method. We can also do an indexer if we want to do the indexer. So now what I'm going to do is we just made that slight change. Now let's run it and see what happens. Oh, well, that's very interesting, Brian. Why did this happen? Why all of a sudden do we have no JSON being generated? Well, when you're using dynamic objects, remember, you are responsible for everything. And so if you take this route, there is more responsibility put on you to make sure that you're getting what you want out of dynamic objects. So in this case, we actually have to create a custom JSON serializer, which actually it's not too bad. So let's create a new class. I'm gonna call it dynamic serializer. And this is going to derive from a JSON converter. Actually, I don't like that. Let's call it dynamic converter. And this is going to be from a JSON converter. I think that's what it's called, converter of T, which is the object type, in this case, dynamic. And let's add serialization. And then we'll need to implement the abstract base class. So we don't necessarily care about read in this demo, but what I do care about is the write. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement the write. Now, writing this is very easy. As you can see, our incoming object to serialize is the dynamic object. So we're going to start by using the writer, and we're going to write the start object. This is essentially the open curly brace. And then we want to make sure we have write the end object, which is the closing curly brace of our output. Okay. Now what we have to do is we have to iterate through each key value pair and write those out. In order to do that, we need access to this dictionary here. So I can make this internal, for example. Whoops. And then I can do something like this, you know, for each var key value pair in value dot dictionary, right? So we're going to loop through each of those. Now we can say writer, whoops, writer.write string. We want to be able to write the string out, and we'll say key value pair dot key, and then key value pair dot, oops, key value pair dot value, and I'm going to toString this. Now the last step here is we need to tell the serializer to use our new serializer that we've just created. So this is going to be called, I think it's converters. And this is going to be, this is essentially an array of converters, or a list, if you will. So you want to make sure that when you define this, you can define it easily, just like something like this. It's really easy to define a list. And then I'm going to add our new dynamic converter in here, like so. And this should be all we need to fix that problem. So now we're getting the same result, right? We see the same result here. Everything's the same. The only difference here is that because we switched to using the dynamic object that we created and that we're managing because we want to do something special, we had to handle the conversion ourselves with a dynamic converter. But that's essentially it. So I just wanted to make sure that when you're dealing with dynamic objects, you were knowledgeable about all your options. You know, you're not stuck with just ExpandoObject. And if you are, we saw how to use ExpandoObject. But if you wanted to get, you know, more complex, or you had specialized needs, you can create your own dynamic object and then do whatever you want with it. Create an API that makes sense to you, that you can use, that you're happy with. But just realize that when you go down the custom route, there are some things that you have to take in consideration. If you're not converting these to JSON, you don't need a dynamic converter, but just be aware that when you go the custom route, you may need more custom code. But that's it for this video. I hope I was able to teach you a little more about dynamic ExpandoObjects and the dynamic object itself. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.